The docile Spanish Mastiff suddenly began to bark incessantly in front of the 2-year-old girl's bedroom door. When the girl's parents discovered the reason, they were both in shock. Lucas and Sarah had found a peaceful life in Gatlinburg, a small town where time seemed to run slower. They lived with their daughter Carla, a joyful 8-year-old girl, and their loyal companion, Dulcie, a Spanish Mastiff. The family's daily life revolved around laughter and moments shared in their modest home. Dulcie, always attentive, was Carla's shadow, following her everywhere and watching over her with a devotion Lucas always admired. Afternoons were filled with the sound of Carla running through the garden, her laughter echoing as Dulcie chased after her. "She's the best dog we've ever had," Sarah would say every night as she stroked Dulcie before bed. But something changed. Without warning, the nights that had once been calm and undisturbed started to fill with unsettling sounds. At first, Lucas and Sarah didn't pay much attention. They attributed Dulcie's nighttime growls to some external noise, perhaps a stray cat or the creaking of branches in the wind. However, as the nights went on, those growls turned into barking. Deep, tense barks, as if Dulcie was alerting them to something that no one else could see. Lucas, who was usually a heavy sleeper, would wake up in the middle of the night with his heart racing, confused by the incessant barking coming from his daughter's room. "Sarah, have you noticed what's going on with Dulce lately?" he asked one night as he lay back in bed, his face showing signs of concern. Sarah nodded, her expression mirroring the same unease. "Yes, Lucas, but I don't know what could be causing this. Dulce has never acted like this before." The nights continued with the same uneasiness. Dulcie would stand in front of Carla's bed, her eyes fixed on the darkness. Her barking, increasingly desperate, shattered the silence, and the air in the house grew heavy, filled with tension and something else. Something Lucas and Sarah couldn't quite name. One night, after almost a week of hearing those barks, Lucas decided to stay awake. He wanted to understand what was happening. If Dulcie was seeing or hearing something, he needed to be able to notice it too. So, when everyone went to bed, he settled on the couch in the hallway right outside Carla's room. It was midnight when the barking started again, this time without warning. From inside the room, Dulcie stood, her fur bristling as if an invisible threat was stalking her. Lucas got up quickly, his heart pounding. He carefully opened the door to the room, trying not to make a sound so as not to wake Carla. The scene that greeted him left him frozen. Dulcie was at the foot of Carla's bed, growling at the darkness under the bed. Her eyes shone under the dim moonlight streaming through the window. Something in the room felt strange. The air was colder, and a shiver ran down Lucas's spine. He knelt next to Dulcie, trying to see what she saw, but there was nothing. "Dulcie, calm down," he whispered, his voice trembling. But Dulcie wasn't listening. Her growls continued, her eyes still fixed beneath the bed, as if something was moving down there, something only she could sense. Lucas felt a cold sweat on his forehead and decided to lift the blanket to look underneath. Nothing. Just the wooden floor and the heavy silence that answered him. Confused, Lucas returned to bed, unable to shake off Dulcie's behavior from his mind. He slept poorly that night, waking up several times to the sound of the barks that wouldn't stop. When morning came, he could no longer ignore the issue. He sat down with Sarah in the kitchen and told her what he had seen. "I don't know, Sarah. Dulcie is scared of something, but I don't know what. There was nothing in the room, at least nothing visible." Sarah bit her lip, a gesture she often made when she was worried. "Maybe we should take her to the vet. What if she's sick? Or what if she's becoming dangerous for Carla?" Lucas nodded slowly. The thought had crossed his mind more than once. What if Dulcie, their loyal protector, had become a threat? Lucas watched Sarah as she put on her coat. The idea that Dulcie might be sick or worse might pose a danger to Carla had been haunting him for days. He couldn't imagine life without Dulcie, but his daughter's safety was the most important thing. He looked down at Dulcie, who was still lying by the kitchen door, ever vigilant. She didn't seem like the same calm dog as before. Something in her eyes had changed. Her ears twitched to the rhythm of invisible sounds, and her growls, though soft, filled the air with an unsettling feeling. "Let's go," said Lucas, breaking the silence. Sarah nodded, took the car keys, and together they left with Dulcie toward the town's veterinary clinic. The ride to the vet was wrapped in an uncomfortable silence. Sarah stared out the window, avoiding eye contact with Lucas. Both were trying to stay calm, but their thoughts were muddled and dark. Dulcie, in the back seat, also seemed nervous. She moved her head from side to side as if following something that wasn't there, as if she could see something humans couldn't perceive. They arrived at the small clinic, where Dr. Juarez greeted them with a smile. He was an older man with years of experience, known for his patience and kindness. He had cared for Dulcie since she was a puppy, and Lucas trusted his judgment completely. "What's going on with Dulcie?" asked the vet as he gently stroked her, noticing the tension in her body. Lucas explained Dulcie's strange behavior, detailing how she had started growling and barking for no apparent reason at night, especially in Carla's room. Sarah, her voice barely concealing her worry, added, "We're concerned she might be sick, or that something in the house is upsetting her." Dr. Juarez furrowed his brow, focused on his examination. He checked Dulcie carefully, her eyes, her ears, her reflexes. After several minutes, he straightened up and looked at them with a calm expression. "Dulcie is completely healthy," he said confidently. "I don't see any signs of illness or pain. Her reflexes are normal, and there doesn't appear to be anything physically wrong with her." Lucas let out a sigh of relief, but Sarah didn't seem so convinced. "Then what could be causing her so much stress?" she asked. The vet crossed his arms, deep in thought. "It's hard to say. Sometimes dogs react to things we can't see or hear. It could be a change in the environment, or perhaps something happening inside the house that she's sensing differently." Lucas and Sarah exchanged glances. The answer didn't bring them much peace. If it wasn't a physical problem, then Dulcie was reacting to something in their home. But what? The vet suggested they consult an animal behavior specialist, though he warned that sometimes these issues don't have a clear solution. They returned home without any definitive answers. Dulcie walked behind them, as attentive as ever, but now every movement of hers seemed more significant. What was she seeing? What was she feeling? That same night, they decided not to let Dulcie sleep in Carla's room. They shut the door and left her outside, hoping this would calm her behavior. But it didn't. In fact, the situation worsened. Dulcie, instead of calming down, began barking and scratching at the door with an intensity Lucas and Sarah had never seen before. Each bark was more desperate than the last, as if she was trying to warn them of something dangerous. Through the wood, they could hear her deep, furious growls, so different from the gentle Dulcie they knew. That night, they decided to no longer resist Dulcie's insistence. Lucas and Sarah prepared to sleep in Carla's room, each trying to make sense of what was happening. Sarah, still hoping it was all just a coincidence, lay down next to her daughter in bed. The little girl slept soundly, unaware of the tension surrounding them. Lucas, on the other hand, settled into the armchair at the foot of the bed, flashlight by his side, ready to observe whatever might happen. Dulcie entered behind them, walking with determination, her eyes fixed on Carla's bed. The atmosphere in the room felt heavy, as if something invisible was floating in the air. The windows were closed, yet an uncomfortable chill seeped through the walls, making Sarah shiver under the blankets. Lucas tried to keep his eyes open, watching for any strange movement. However, exhaustion eventually overtook him, and little by little, his eyelids closed. The night progressed, silent and almost still. But then, in the middle of the darkness, Sarah felt something. A slight sensation on her leg that jolted her awake. Her body tensed, and without moving, she glanced down. What she saw paralyzed her completely. A huge spider with long, hairy legs was slowly crawling up her leg, making its way toward her thigh. Sarah's heart began to race so fast that she could barely contain the scream rising in her throat. "Lucas!" she yelled, her voice filled with terror, as she yanked the blanket off in a frenzy. Lucas jumped up immediately, confused by his wife's scream. The terror in her voice shook him, and as his eyes finally adjusted to the dim light in the room, he saw what was happening. Another spider, just as large, was crawling up her arm. Reflexively, she shook it off forcefully, making the arachnid fall to the ground with a dry thud. Dulcie, who had been watching tensely until that moment, began to bark ferociously. Her fur stood on end as she rushed toward the bed, growling and lunging at something Lucas couldn't clearly see. Sarah, still frozen, tried to move Carla without waking her as the spiders seemed to multiply around them. Lucas, his hands trembling, turned on the flashlight and pointed it under the bed. What it illuminated left him frozen. A nest of giant spiders, dozens of them, all moving slowly in the darkness. The shadows of their hairy, shiny bodies reflected on the wooden floor, some crawling up the legs of Carla's bed. "Sarah, get Carla out of here!" Lucas shouted, unable to tear his gaze away from the nightmare unfolding before him. Sarah didn't hesitate. She scooped up her daughter, who was now stirring in her sleep, and ran toward the door. Meanwhile, Dulcie kept growling, lunging at the spiders that tried to crawl up the sides of the bed. Her jaws clamped down on the creatures' bodies, crushing them with a crack that echoed through the room. Panting, Lucas joined Sarah in the hallway. He shut the door behind them, but Dulcie's growls and the crunching of spiders could still be heard clearly from the other side. Sarah collapsed to the floor, still holding Carla in her arms, trying to steady her breathing. "What the hell was that, Lucas?" she asked, her voice trembling, her eyes fixed on the closed door. Lucas didn't know how to respond. His mind was clouded, unable to process what he had just witnessed. Giant spiders, a nest under his daughter's bed, and Dulcie's behavior, which now finally made sense. All along, Dulcie had been trying to protect them from this invisible threat. "I don't know," he finally replied, disbelief evident in his voice. But Dulcie knew something was wrong from the start. The hallway was dark, illuminated only by the flashlight Lucas still held in his hand. They could hear Dulcie's last barks, growing fainter until everything was enveloped in an eerie silence. Lucas and Sarah exchanged a worried glance. They knew they couldn't just sit there and do nothing. "We need to get Dulcie out of there," Sarah said firmly, though fear still gripped her. Lucas nodded, gathering what courage he had left. He gripped the flashlight tighter and headed back to the door. When he opened it, what he saw sent a final wave of panic through him. The floor of the room was covered in the remains of the spiders. Some were still moving slowly, but most had been taken down by Dulcie, who now panted heavily near the bed. The air was thick with a strange smell, a mix of dampness and something unidentifiable. Without thinking twice, Lucas entered the room and in a soft voice called Dulcie. The dog, exhausted but alert, approached him, still growling slightly, as if she wasn't convinced the danger had passed. Lucas, his heart still racing, gently stroked her. "Good girl," he murmured. "You saved us." The next morning, Lucas and Sarah decided not to waste any more time. The events of the previous night lingered in their minds, like a persistent echo that wouldn't fade. The memory of those spiders, giant and strange, clung to every corner of the house, turning every shadow or sound into something terrifying. They couldn't just let it go. They decided to call an animal specialist, someone who could definitively explain what was happening. The call was brief. The specialist, a man of few words but with a solid reputation in the region, agreed to visit the house that very afternoon. Lucas and Sarah, though relieved to know help was on the way, couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that something bigger was lurking beneath the surface of their worries. The day passed slowly. Every minute seemed to stretch as if time itself had come to a halt. Sarah busied herself by keeping Carla occupied, making sure the girl didn't notice the tension that filled the house. Lucas, for his part, couldn't stop pacing through the house, checking every corner, making sure there were no more signs of those horrible creatures. Finally, the afternoon arrived. The specialist, an older man with a grey beard and thick glasses, arrived punctually. His name was Pedro, and, from the first moment, his serious and professional demeanor inspired confidence. He carried a large suitcase filled with tools and special containers ready for any unexpected discoveries. Lucas led him to Carla's room, where the traces of the previous night's battle still remained. Pedro crouched next to the bed, shining a powerful flashlight on the floor. His eyes squinted as he examined every detail with the precision that showed his experience. "This is where the nest was," said Lucas, pointing to the empty space under the bed. Despite having cleaned up most of the mess, the memory remained fresh in his mind. Pedro nodded slowly. Without saying a word, he pulled a small jar from his suitcase and carefully slid it under the bed, collecting the remaining cobwebs. He took his time, observing carefully, moving the flashlight in different directions. Finally, he stood up and looked at Lucas and Sarah with a furrowed brow. "What you found last night is not common in this area," he commented gravely. "These spiders aren't venomous, that's true, but their size and behavior aren't normal for this region." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Something about the way Pedro spoke, in his slow, careful tone, made her feel that what he was about to say wouldn't be easy to hear. "Where did they come from then?" she asked, a mix of fear and curiosity in her voice. Pedro paused, adjusting his glasses before responding. "It seems like they've been brought here from somewhere else, maybe even intentionally. It's not uncommon for people to keep exotic species like these, though they shouldn't be here, and certainly not under a little girl's bed." The afternoon dragged on, with a palpable tension hanging in the air that enveloped Lucas and Sarah's home. After Pedro's unsettling revelation, the idea that the spiders might have been brought there on purpose haunted their minds. While Sarah tried to distract Carla, who fortunately was still unaware of the gravity of the situation, Lucas couldn't stop thinking about their neighbor, Carlos. Carlos was a solitary man, quiet and always on the outskirts of neighborhood life. He didn't interact with anyone, and the little they knew about him was that he spent most of his time in his garage, an enigmatic place no one had had the chance to inspect closely. The spider situation, Dulcie's strange behavior, and now Pedro's words, all signs seemed to point to that place. Lucas, ever cautious, knew he couldn't accuse Carlos without proof, but his instincts told him he needed to investigate. That afternoon, with Sarah busy with Carla, he decided to take a casual walk around the neighborhood. As he walked toward the corner, he couldn't help but glance at Carlos's house. The garage, as usual, had its door closed, but the small side window offered a limited view inside. Lucas stopped a few meters away, observing without trying to seem too obvious. The silence around the house felt unsettling. There were no cars in the garage, nor any signs that anyone was working there, but the curtains over the window fluttered slightly in the breeze. "Just a quick look," he thought. He approached stealthily, his heart pounding in his chest until he reached the window. At first, he only saw metal shelves filled with boxes and jars, but as he got closer, his breath caught for a moment. On the shelves nearest the window, he could make out several glass containers, each holding something alive. Some jars contained small snakes, slowly coiling, while others were filled with insects and spiders, many identical to the ones he had found under Carla's bed. Lucas stepped back, horrified. There was no doubt Carlos was breeding these creatures, and somehow those spiders had ended up in his home, in his daughter's room. The fear quickly turned into a firm decision. Lucas ran back home, the weight of his discovery sinking into his chest. When he arrived, Sarah looked at him with concern, noticing the tense expression on his face. "What's wrong, Lucas?" she asked, setting aside the book she was reading to Carla. Lucas met her gaze, his voice low and trembling. "It's Carlos. I saw his garage. It's full of jars with snakes and spiders, just like the ones we found in Carla's room." Sarah fell silent for a moment, trying to process what her husband had just told her. The possibility that their neighbor had deliberately brought those creatures into their home, endangering their daughter, filled her with a quiet rage. "What are we going to do?" she finally asked, her eyes full of worry. "I'm going to call the police," Lucas answered, resolute. "We can't handle this on our own." Sarah nodded, trusting her husband's judgment. As Lucas dialed the number, a sense of urgency filled the air. The police arrived shortly after, alerted by Lucas's worried tone on the phone. 2 officers arrived at the door, listening attentively as Lucas told them about his suspicious neighbor and the creatures he had seen in the garage. The officers, although somewhat skeptical at first, decided to accompany him to verify the place. Lucas led them to Carlos's house, his heart pounding. They didn't know what to expect, but the gravity of the situation could no longer be ignored. When they arrived at the garage, they knocked firmly on the door. "Mr. Carlos, we're with the police. We need to speak with you." For a few seconds there was no response. The silence that followed was unbearable. Finally, the garage door slowly opened and Carlos appeared with a calm yet distrustful expression. "What do you want?" he asked quietly, his dark eyes eyeing the officers suspiciously. "We've received a complaint from your neighbors," one of the officers said. "We'd like to inspect your garage." Carlos hesitated for a moment, his gaze landing on Lucas, as if he knew exactly who had accused him. However, he eventually stepped aside and allowed the officers to enter. The inside of the garage was more disorganized than Lucas had imagined. Jars, boxes, and containers were piled everywhere, some filled with exotic animals moving slowly in their makeshift cages. The snakes lazily coiled, and the spiders in their small glass jars seemed oblivious to the chaos around them. Lucas watched as the officers inspected every corner, their expressions growing more tense as they discovered more jars with strange creatures. Finally, one of the officers turned to Carlos. "This is not allowed. You have dangerous species here that shouldn't be in a residential area," he said firmly. Carlos, showing little emotion, only nodded. "I didn't know it was a problem. I just collect animals. They're not dangerous." But Lucas knew that wasn't true. What had happened in his house confirmed it. After a deeper inspection, the officers found several spiders identical to the ones from the nest under Carla's bed. Confronted with the evidence, Carlos finally confessed that, due to his obsession with exotic animals, he had released some spiders in the neighborhood when they had gotten out of control. "I didn't think they'd cause any problems," he said in a low voice. The anger Lucas had felt was now mixed with deep relief. Carlos was arrested, charged with endangering the community through his irresponsible actions. As they took him away, Lucas walked over to Sarah and hugged her tightly. They knew the danger had passed, but the scars from that experience would remain etched in their memory forever. After the police took Carlos away, the atmosphere in the neighborhood seemed to shift. The usual calm of the street returned, but Lucas and Sarah knew that the peace wouldn't be the same. For weeks, their nights had been invaded by fear, confusion, and the growing suspicion that someone nearby had brought danger to their doorstep. Now, with Carlos in custody, the immediate threat had disappeared, but the memory of what had happened lingered, like a persistent shadow that refused to fully disappear. The trial, as expected, captured everyone's attention in the small town. Local newspaper headlines told the story. Man arrested for releasing dangerous animals in family neighborhood, while rumors and conversations in the market and shops grew day by day. The community, once close-knit, now viewed their neighbors with more caution. Who could have imagined that Carlos, the quiet, solitary man at the end of the street, had harbored such a sinister interest in exotic animals? Lucas and Sarah decided to attend the trial. It wasn't an easy decision, but they knew that witnessing the process was necessary to find closure for what they had lived through. In the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense, almost suffocating. Carlos, with his gaunt appearance and showing no emotion, sat in front of the judges. He seemed resigned to his fate, but his indifferent attitude only fueled Lucas's pent-up anger. "I didn't think they'd do any harm," Carlos said, his monotone voice echoing in the room. "I only let them go because I didn't know what to do with them. I never imagined they'd end up in your house." That statement, so devoid of responsibility, only heightened the frustration for Lucas and Sarah. How could he think that releasing dangerous animals wouldn't cause harm? How could he have been so irresponsible? But Carlos's words weren't enough to mitigate the weight of the evidence against him. The testimonies of animal experts, police reports, and Lucas's statements sealed his fate. In the end, the judge ruled that Carlos was guilty of endangering his neighbors' lives and of keeping dangerous species without the proper authorization. He was sentenced to a considerable prison term and was strictly prohibited from ever keeping exotic animals again. For Lucas and Sarah, the sentencing brought a deep sense of relief. They felt that justice had finally been served, though they knew that the emotional damage wouldn't fade so easily. As they left the courthouse, Sarah gripped Lucas's hand tightly. Both knew that, although the trial was over, there was still a long road ahead before their lives would return to normal. Back at home, the family decided to take extra measures to protect their home. Lucas installed security cameras and reinforced the locks. Every corner of the house was carefully inspected to ensure there were no traces left of the terrible creatures that had invaded their home. Dulce, as loyal as ever, watched her owner's every move, as if understanding the importance of keeping the family safe. After everything that had happened, Lucas and Sarah couldn't help but see Dulce in a new light. The chaos of the past few weeks had changed their perception of her. She was no longer just a pet, but a faithful guardian, a protector who had shown relentless bravery in the face of danger. While Carla played with her dolls on the living room floor, Dulce, as always, stayed by her side, watchful. The little girl, completely unaware of what had happened, continued to trust her four-legged friend without hesitation. Sarah, watching the scene from the kitchen, felt a deep sense of gratitude. Things could have been so much worse if Dulce hadn't detected the threat in time. Lucas, who was installing the last of the security cameras outside the house, shared that same feeling. Every time he looked at the dog, a sense of safety settled in his chest. A security that didn't come from the cameras or reinforced locks, but from Dulce's mere presence. After Carlos's trial and sentencing, the family began to regain a sense of calm. Although the first few days were difficult, with frequent startles at every nighttime noise, the house slowly started to feel safe again. However, Lucas and Sarah knew they would never forget what had happened. The emotional scars from the experience had marked them deeply, a reminder of the fragility of the security they once took for granted. One afternoon, as they were relaxing on the back porch, Sarah broke the silence. "Do you realize how lucky we were?" Her voice was soft but full of emotion. "It could have been so much worse, Lucas. If it hadn't been for Dulce, I don't know what would have happened." Lucas, who had been absent-mindedly gazing at the garden, turned to look at her. His expression was calm, but his eyes showed the weight of the recent weeks. "I know, Sarah," he replied. "I can't stop thinking about it. Dulce saved us, and not just Carla. She saved all of us, in one way or another." They both remained silent, enjoying the fresh evening air. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, and Dulce lay near the door, her eyes alert, as if she'd never let her guard down. That night, while the family had dinner together, Lucas and Sarah decided it was time to do something special for Dulcie. Carla was enjoying a homemade meal, smiling and talking about her games, unaware that the adults had a plan in mind to honor their loyal friend. "Let's throw her a little party," said Sarah with a smile. "She deserves it." Lucas nodded, happy with the idea. "Yes, let's invite a few friends and do something simple but meaningful. Dulcie deserves all our gratitude." Carla, hearing her dog's name, looked up excitedly. "A party for Dulcie?" she asked, her eyes shining. "How exciting! I'll make her a special dog cake." Sarah chuckled softly as she stroked her daughter's hair. Despite everything that had happened, the sparkle in Carla's eyes and her genuine happiness were a reminder of how important it was to keep innocence and love intact, even in the face of adversity. The day of the celebration arrived quickly. It wasn't a big party, but it was intimate and special enough to honor the one who had protected the family. A few close friends and neighbors who already knew the story came to share a pleasant moment. Dulcie, in her usual humble way, seemed unaware of the reason for the celebration, but her calm and protective attitude toward Carla didn't go unnoticed. Lucas, standing by the table in the yard, raised a glass as the group gathered around him. "Today, we're not just celebrating a dog," he began, his voice steady but full of emotion. "We're celebrating a member of our family, Dulcie, who, without asking for anything in return, has protected us and shown us what true loyalty is." The group toasted in silence, respecting the weight of Lucas's words. Dulcie, unaware of the reason for the toast, stayed by Carla's side, wagging her tail with a calmness that contrasted with the intensity of recent events. After the party, life began to return to a more normal pace. Lucas and Sarah no longer jumped at every nighttime noise, and a sense of tranquility once again settled in their home. However, what stayed with them most from the whole experience was the profound lesson about life in a community and the importance of remaining vigilant, even when everything seems in order. They knew they could never blindly trust that danger was far away because, as they had learned, the greatest threats sometimes come from nearby, from people you think you know. Yet, not everything they learned was negative. Lucas and Sarah also realized they were not alone. Dulcie had shown them that there are always those who, quietly and discreetly, are willing to protect what we love most. That thought filled them with comfort. A few months later, on a warm spring afternoon, Lucas was sitting on the back porch, watching Dulcie and Carla running around the garden. The little girl's laughter echoed in the air, filling the atmosphere with a peace he hadn't felt in a long time. Dulcie, at her side, wagged her tail energetically as she followed her young owner. The fear that had once filled their hearts now seemed like a distant memory. Sarah, carrying 2 cups of coffee, sat beside him and watched the scene with a smile on her lips. "We've been very lucky," she said, placing a hand on Lucas's shoulder. "Yes, we have," he replied, taking a sip of coffee. "But we've also learned to appreciate what we have, don't you think?" Sarah nodded slowly. "Every day is a gift. Dulcie taught us that. Sometimes the most valuable things are the ones we least expect." They both fell silent, enjoying the moment, the calm, and each other's company. Carla and Dulcie continued playing under the clear sky while the sun slowly dipped below the horizon, painting the world in soft, warm tones. That night, as everyone prepared for bed, Lucas looked at Dulcie once more before turning off the light. He knew that as long as she was there, the family would be safe. Nothing and no one could harm them while the brave guardian of the house stayed by their side. Dulcie, with her alert eyes and unshakable calm, continued to fulfill her silent promise. She would protect her family, no matter what. The story we've explored is one of suspense and psychological horror that takes us on an emotional journey, highlighting the transformation of the characters as they face danger and adversity. Lucas and Sarah, an apparently ordinary couple, watch as their peaceful life slowly unravels after discovering the threat lurking in their own home. What once seemed like a safe, everyday neighborhood becomes the setting for a chilling mystery, where the true dangers arise from those close by and the unknown. The development of Dulcie, the loyal dog, is particularly impressive. From the beginning, her unusual behavior is interpreted as a warning sign, but only later is the full extent of her loyalty and bravery revealed. Throughout the story, Dulce is not just a pet, but a silent guardian who protects her family without asking for anything in return. Her transformation from a simple companion animal to a heroine highlights the importance of valuing those around us, even when we don't fully understand their role in our lives. The central message of this story is one of trust and vigilance, but also the need to appreciate what truly matters: the love, loyalty, and care we receive from our loved ones, whether human or animal. It reminds us that danger can be closer than we imagine, but also that the strength of a united family, supported by mutual trust, can overcome any adversity. Lucas and Sarah's journey teaches us not to take anything for granted and to stay alert to the signs, always valuing the small, great things that protect and support us. If you find this story as moving as we do, please give it a like and comment to let us know how you feel. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on more meaningful stories.